You open your phone late at night. You search, how do I find my purpose? The question feels urgent, but the urgency didn't start with a search. It started earlier, when someone asked what you're building, when you hesitated before answering, when you saw someone your age moving fast. The discomfort isn't confusion, it's exposure. Exposure to comparison. Comparison creates timeline pressure. Timeline pressure creates panic, and panic sends you searching. Searching feels active, but notice what happens internally. You collect advice. You bookmark videos. You write notes. You feel temporarily hopeful. Then you close the app, and nothing changes. That cycle repeats. Hope, consumption, silence, doubt. This isn't lack of purpose. It's lack of narrowing. When everything remains possible, nothing becomes real. An undefined future feels powerful. You can imagine multiple successful versions of yourself. But imagination without reduction creates instability. Your brain prefers finite structures. It can organize limits. It struggles with infinite options. So when you refuse to narrow, your mind keeps scanning. Scanning feels productive, but it prevents commitment. And without commitment, nothing compounds. Now pause. Think about the last 3 directions you considered seriously. Did you stop because they were wrong? Or because something else looked interesting? There's a difference. Wrong feels heavy. Interesting feels tempting. Temptation resets momentum. Momentum requires continuity. Continuity requires exclusion. Exclusion feels uncomfortable because it removes fantasy paths. But fantasy paths are weightless. Real paths require effort, so you remain in evaluation mode. Evaluation mode protects you from failure because you never fully enter the arena, but it also protects you from growth. Now, consider something subtle. If you had to remove half of your current options, how would that feel? Relief or anxiety? If it feels like relief, your problem is overload. If it feels like anxiety, your problem is identity. Because when you narrow, you start defining who you are not, and that feels permanent. But most narrowing is temporary. The fear of permanence is exaggerated. You don't need a lifetime decision. You need a direction long enough to test. But testing requires structure. Structure feels limiting. Freedom feels safer. Yet unlimited freedom often creates paralysis because direction emerges from constraint, not from endless possibility. Right now, your confusion may not be about purpose. It may be about excess. Excess information, excess comparison, excess alternatives, excess potential. Reduction creates clarity. Clarity creates movement. Movement builds evidence. Evidence builds confidence. Confidence stabilizes direction, but it starts with narrowing, not discovering. Even after you understand the structural mistake, something still resists. You know you should narrow. You know you should choose one direction, but you hesitate. This hesitation is not confusion. It is fear, not loud fear, quiet fear, because choosing one path means eliminating others. And elimination feels like loss. When you don't choose, every possible version of you stays alive. The entrepreneur, the artist, the academic, the traveler, all of them remain intact. In imagination, imagination preserves potential. Reality reduces it, and reduction feels threatening. So you delay. You tell yourself you are still exploring, still thinking, still preparing. But often, you are protecting something deeper. Undefined identity feels expansive. Defined identity feels exposed. Because once defined, it can be measured, evaluated, compared. And comparison introduces a terrifying possibility. What if I'm just average? This is rarely spoken, but it is powerful. If you never commit, you never receive clear feedback. And without feedback, your self-image remains intact, untested, safe, but also stagnant. Growth requires exposure. Exposure requires commitment. And commitment creates pressure. Now notice the thoughts that appear when you imagine choosing something specific. Am I good enough? What if I waste time? Both sound rational, but both are protective. The first protects your ego. The second protects your comfort. Neither protects your future. Because growth demands 2 uncomfortable things: risk and irreversible time investment. Time is what makes commitment heavy. Once you invest months into something, you cannot get them back. That irreversibility creates tension, so you postpone. Postponing preserves optionality, but optionality prevents depth, and depth is where competence is built. This is another silent conflict. You may start energized, but when repetition replaces excitement, Your brain searches for novelty. Novelty feels productive. Repetition feels slow. Yet repetition is what builds skill. And skill is what stabilizes direction. Without skill, every path feels uncertain. So you leave. You interpret discomfort as misalignment. But often, discomfort is simply the moment when beginner status ends and real effort begins. That is a critical point. Most people exit there because it stops feeling inspiring and starts feeling demanding. Demanding exposes limits. Limits feel threatening. Now think about your past attempts. Were they truly wrong, or did they just reach the demanding phase? If every direction feels wrong after a few months, the pattern may not be misalignment. It may be avoidance of depth. Depth forces identity to solidify. It requires you to say, "This is who I am becoming." And that sentence feels heavy because it implies continuity, responsibility, showing up again, even when you don't feel like it. There's another illusion you might be carrying. You believe that once you find purpose, motivation will become automatic, but motivation fluctuates. Commitment does not. If direction depends on mood, direction collapses. Purpose cannot rely on daily emotional weather. It must rely on structure. This is uncomfortable because it removes drama. There is no lightning strike, no grand revelation, just quiet decisions, repeated, unseen, uncelebrated. And that feels less romantic than the idea of destiny, but far more real. Now we arrive at the deeper fear. If you commit and fail, others might see. Public failure feels permanent. Private indecision feels invisible. So you stay private. You research quietly. You plan quietly. You imagine quietly. But imagination produces no data. No data means no refinement. No refinement means no progress. And progress is what stabilizes identity. At some point, you must allow yourself to become specific. Specific about what you are testing. Specific about what you are improving. Specific about what you are building. Specificity feels risky, but vagueness guarantees drift. Drift feels safe in the short term, empty in the long term. And that emptiness, that quiet dissatisfaction, is what brought you here. Not lack of talent, not lack of intelligence, lack of narrowing, lack of sustained exposure. Purpose does not hide from you, but it does require something difficult. It requires you to tolerate becoming someone specific. And that is where most people stop. But you don't have to, because there is a way to move forward without turning your life into a permanent decision. And that shift is smaller than you think. It is not about finding your life's purpose. It is about reducing the scope. Instead of asking, "What is my purpose?" ask, "What am I willing to test seriously for the next 90 days? Notice the difference. The first question feels infinite. The second is finite. Finite reduces pressure. Pressure is what keeps you frozen. So choose one direction. Just one, not forever. For container time, do not announce it publicly. Do not redefine your identity. Treat it as an experiment. Experiments have rules, a time frame, a measurable output. They are procedural, not emotional. If writing interests you, the experiment is not become a writer. It is write twice per week for 12 weeks. Nothing more. No identity attached. No grand future narrative. Just repetition inside a container. Containers create safety. Without a container, commitment feels infinite. Infinite feels overwhelming. Finite feels manageable. And something shifts psychologically when you do this. Fear reduces because experiments allow adjustment. They are not life sentences. They are structured tests. Most people imagine, consider, talk, but they never build containers. And containers are where purpose actually begins, not in emotion, in containment. Now you are no longer searching for destiny. You are generating evidence. And evidence changes everything. After narrowing, after choosing a direction to test, after creating a container, something begins. Not clarity, not passion, structure. And structure is not emotional. It is behavioral. You define the time frame. You define the repetition. And you begin showing up. At first, nothing feels different. There is no revelation, no surge of meaning, just repetition. And this is where most people misread the process. They expect early emotional confirmation. Instead, they encounter neutrality. Sometimes boredom, sometimes doubt. But neutrality is not a red flag. It is the absence of fantasy. Fantasy is intense. Reality is incremental. Now something subtle shifts. After a few weeks inside the container, you stop scanning for alternatives every day. Because a decision has already been made. Temporarily, this reduces cognitive noise. When noise decreases, focus increases. When focus increases, skill begins to form. Skill formation is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. But you start noticing small differences. Your thinking sharpens. Your questions become more precise. Your output improves slightly. This improvement is not dramatic, but it is measurable. And measurable improvement creates something powerful. Evidence. Evidence is different from belief. Belief is emotional. Evidence is experiential. When you accumulate evidence, doubt does not disappear, but it weakens because now you have data. You are no longer imagining who you could be. You are observing who you are becoming. This is the missing middle, not inspiration, not destiny. Structure repetition long enough to generate information about yourself. Now your internal question changes. Instead of asking, "What is my purpose?" you begin asking, "What am I learning about myself through this repetition?" That question is grounded. It produces clarity slowly. Inside the container, patterns start to emerge. You notice what drains you consistently. You notice what holds your attention, even when it's difficult. You notice what improves faster than expected. You notice what feels meaningful only after effort. This is not imagined identity. This is experienced identity. And experienced identity is stable. Now add another layer. Usefulness. When your developing skill begins to benefit someone else, even slightly, feedback enters the system. Not praise. Feedback. Real responses. Real impact. This anchors your effort in reality. Without usefulness, effort feels abstract. With usefulness, effort feels connected. Connection sustains commitment longer than excitement ever could. Excitement is volatile. Contribution is stabilizing. Now understand something important. Doubt will still appear, even while you build. But doubt feels different when you have evidence. Imagination exaggerates risk. Evidence clarifies it. For example, if you show up consistently for 6 months, you know more about that field than someone who only contemplates it. That knowledge builds practical certainty, not emotional certainty, practical certainty. And practical certainty is stronger because it does not rely on mood. It relies on accumulated experience. Now we need to talk about time. Most people underestimate duration. They expect identity to stabilize in weeks, but identity forms through repetition over years. Years of small corrections, years of refinement, years of adjusting direction slightly, not dramatically. That sounds slow, but compare it to the alternative. Years of restarting, years of evaluating, years of remaining undefined. Undefined years feel flexible, but they do not compound. Depth compounds, and compounding is invisible at first, then noticeable, then undeniable. When compounding becomes undeniable, direction feels obvious, but only in hindsight. Now ask yourself something more precise. How do you know you are building something real? Not by excitement, not by absence of doubt, but by this. Are you improving? Is someone benefiting? Are you willing to continue despite imperfection? If those 3 conditions are present, construction is happening, and construction precedes meaning. Meaning follows contribution. Contribution follows competence. Competence follows repetition. This sequence is not glamorous, but it is reliable. Over time, what began as a temporary test becomes routine. What was routine begins shaping identity. What shapes identity reduces internal friction. And when friction reduces, you stop questioning constantly, not because you solve the abstract question of purpose, but because you are engaged in building something specific. Engagement replaces anxiety. Direction replaces comparison. Specificity replaces drift. And slowly, without announcement, you stop searching, not because you found a perfect answer, but because you are too busy becoming someone real. Purpose is not a single realization. It is accumulated specificity. It is sustained exposure. It is structured effort repeated long enough to transform skill into contribution, and contribution into identity. You don't wake up one morning and discover it. You wake up many mornings in a row, show up, adjust, refine, continue, until one day, almost quietly, the life you are repeating starts to feel aligned. Not perfect, aligned. And alignment, even when incomplete, feels lighter than endless searching ever did. Now I want to ask you something. What is one direction you've been postponing? Not your life plan, just something you feel curious about, but haven't committed to testing. Write it in the comments, not as a declaration, as an experiment. And if this video helped you rethink the way you see purpose, subscribe to the channel, because this space is about building clarity through structure, not motivation. We're not chasing inspiration here. We're building direction, slowly, intentionally. And if you're ready to stop searching endlessly and start constructing something real, I'll see you in the next video.